The air felt different that morning, as if something had shifted overnight. The city, which had always been so familiar to me, seemed a little off-kilter, as though it were caught in the moment just before waking up from a dream. The streets were quieter than usual, and the light seemed dimmer, like the sun had forgotten how to shine properly. But I didn't think much of it. I had my usual routine, coffee in hand, headphones in, the hum of the city filling the background, and the rush of thoughts I usually try to avoid. It was just another morning. I walked down the street, my steps automatic, eyes on the sidewalk, lost in thought. It was a street I'd walked down thousands of times, lined with buildings I knew by heart, old brickwork on either side, the same familiar storefronts, a cafe on the corner where I sometimes stopped for a croissant. Nothing had changed in the last few years. Yet today, something about the whole scene felt wrong. As I passed the corner store, I glanced up at the large window, and that's when I saw it. The reflection. At first, I thought it was just the way the light hit the glass, but the reflection staring back at me wasn't right. It was me, of course, but it felt like I was looking at a version of myself from the past. My clothes looked older, more worn, like I had worn them for years instead of just this morning. The shadow of my figure was too sharp, too defined, almost as if it were trying to separate itself from my real self, like it was a ghost that had come to live in the present. I froze for a moment, wondering if I had imagined it, if the dim morning light had played tricks on me, but when I blinked and looked again, my reflection had already changed. It was just me, like normal. But the feeling stuck with me. Something had changed. I couldn't explain it, but the world around me felt older, worn down, as though time had skipped backward for just a moment, leaving me standing at the edge of something forgotten. I walked on, trying to push the strange sensation aside, but the longer I walked, the more it grew. I passed the same shop I always did, the same man in the butcher's window, the same little dog that always barked from behind the glass door. But today, none of it looked the same. The sidewalk was cracked, the door handles too tarnished, the shop windows too foggy. The city felt as if it had aged overnight. The new developments I had seen going up in the last few months were suddenly gone, replaced by old brick buildings, their facades chipped and faded, like they had stood there for decades instead of the few years I remembered. I kept telling myself it was nothing, that it was my mind playing tricks, but as I walked, the feeling deepened. It wasn't just the buildings. People, too, seemed different. Faces I had passed 1,000 times before now felt unfamiliar, as though they weren't the same people I had seen just yesterday. Their clothes were outdated, their expressions clouded with something heavy, something sad, like they carried the weight of forgotten years. They walked past me in a hurry, but their eyes didn't meet mine. There was no acknowledgement of the world around them, just a swift passing, like they were part of a world that had already been forgotten. I reached the park I always cut through on my way to work. The old oak tree in the center of it was as large and gnarled as ever, but even that felt different now, its bark rougher, its branches more twisted, as though it had aged 100 years in a single night. The air around me seemed thicker, harder to breathe. I had walked down this path countless times, but today, the path felt longer, the steps heavier. I couldn't help but look around again, searching for something, anything that could tell me why everything was so wrong. But no matter how hard I looked, it was still the same. The park benches were still lined up in rows, the old fountain was still cracked, and the statue of the man in the center was still standing tall, his marble face frozen in time. Yet everything felt like it belonged to another era. Like I had crossed into another time altogether. It was then that I noticed the woman sitting on the bench by the fountain, her back to me. She had long, dark hair, and her coat was old-fashioned, the kind that would have fit better in a different decade. I walked toward her, wondering why I hadn't seen her before. The way she sat there, so still, so quiet, seemed out of place. As I approached, I thought I recognized her, though I couldn't quite place from where. She turned to look at me, and when she did, a strange wave of recognition washed over me, even though I had never seen her before. She smiled, and for a brief moment, I felt like I had stepped into a memory, like I was part of something I couldn't remember. "Don't be afraid," she said, her voice calm and gentle, as if we had known each other for years. But I didn't know her. Before I could respond, she stood up, her movements slow and deliberate, and began to walk away. I followed her instinctively, the feeling of déjà vu so strong now that it was almost suffocating. I knew I had to keep going, to follow her, but when I turned the corner, she was gone. Just gone. No sign of her anywhere, as if she had never been there at all. I stopped in my tracks, my breath shallow, my heart racing. I looked around me, feeling disoriented, unsure of where I was anymore. I checked the time on my phone, but when I did, my heart skipped. It read 7:30 a.m., the same time I had looked at it when I first left the cafe. But the sun had already set. It was one of those days where everything feels just a little too quiet. The kind of day when the usual noise of the city seems to dissolve into the background, leaving you feeling like you're walking through a dream. I had been running errands all morning, moving from one part of the city to another, checking things off a list that seemed never-ending. I didn't know why I had decided to take that particular alley, or why, when I turned the corner, I found myself standing in front of a small cafe I had never noticed before. The sign was simple, just a faded, handwritten note that read, "The Way Cafe." It was tucked away between two larger buildings, the kind of place that seemed like it had been there forever but didn't draw much attention. The windows were fogged up, and I could barely make out the shapes of tables inside, but there was something about the place that made me want to step inside. I pushed open the door, and the little bell above it jingled softly, announcing my arrival. The smell of coffee and something sweet immediately filled the air. It wasn't busy, just a few people scattered around the room, some reading, others quietly sipping their drinks. The atmosphere was cozy, inviting, as if the outside world had been left behind. The woman behind the counter looked up as I entered. She had dark hair pulled into a loose bun, and her eyes were soft but intense, as though she had seen more than most people ever would. She smiled at me, a warm, knowing smile, and I felt an odd sense of recognition, even though I was sure I had never seen her before. "Welcome," she said softly. "Can I help you with something?" I hesitated for a moment, unsure of what I was doing there. Something about the place felt different. Like it wasn't just a cafe, but a kind of stop, or checkpoint, that I wasn't supposed to bypass. "I'm just looking around," I said, smiling awkwardly. "I've never been here before." She nodded, her smile never faltering. "Most people haven't. But you've come at the right time." I didn't know why, but that statement left me unsettled. It was as if she knew exactly what I needed, even though I hadn't said a word. She motioned toward the small table in the corner, the one by the window, and I found myself walking toward it before I could think to protest. The soft murmur of the cafe faded into the background as I sat down, feeling like I had no control over my actions. The woman came over to me a few minutes later, a steaming cup of coffee in hand, and placed it on the table with a quiet grace. "You're looking for something," she said. It wasn't a question. It felt more like a statement of fact. I opened my mouth to reply, but the words didn't come. How could I explain what I felt? There was a restlessness inside me, a sense that I was always searching, always moving but never getting anywhere. The truth was, I didn't even know what I was searching for. She sat down across from me, her eyes still fixed on mine. "The paths are many," she continued, her voice steady and calm. "But they always lead you back to the same place, don't they?" My heart skipped a beat. Her words felt too familiar, like something I had been trying to put into words for a long time but hadn't been able to. Every decision I made, every step I took, seemed to circle back on itself. It was like I was stuck in a loop, constantly searching for something, but never finding it. I nodded slowly, not trusting myself to speak. The woman smiled again, a soft, knowing smile, and for the first time, I felt like someone understood. "You've tried to take different paths," she said, her eyes never leaving mine. But they all end in the same place, don't they? The same feeling, the same emptiness. I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell her that I hadn't been going in circles, that I had been moving forward, doing things, trying to make sense of everything. But I couldn't. The truth was too heavy, too real. I had been walking through life, chasing after things I couldn't grasp, always thinking that the next step would be the one that would lead me to where I wanted to be. But every path, no matter how different it seemed, had always brought me back to the same point. She stood up, as if sensing the weight of the moment, and placed a hand on my shoulder. Her touch was warm, grounding. "You can keep walking," she said softly, "but the way will always lead you here. The question is, what will you do when you get back?" I stared at her, confused. "What do you mean?" She smiled again, but this time it was different, not as soft, but with a sense of finality. "The only way out is through. But it's up to you whether you want to stay in the loop or break free." I didn't understand. The words felt like a riddle, something I couldn't quite piece together. The cafe, the woman, everything around me seemed to fade away for a moment, leaving me in a quiet silence. I looked around the room, but nothing seemed familiar. The tables were empty now, the patrons gone, and the soft hum of conversation had disappeared. The only thing that remained was the woman's voice, echoing in my mind. I stood up and walked toward the door, my heart pounding. The moment my hand touched the handle, I glanced back at her, expecting to see her still sitting at the table. But she was gone. The table was empty, and the cafe felt hollow, as if it had never existed in the first place. I stepped outside into the street, the same street I had walked down earlier. But when I looked around, something was different. The buildings were the same, the cars were the same, but the people were different. They moved in ways I hadn't noticed before, their faces blurred, as if I were seeing them through a fog. The world around me had changed, but it was the same. The same feeling of emptiness lingered, and I knew, deep down, that no matter which direction I took, I would only end up back where I started. I walked down the street, feeling the weight of her words settle on my chest. The paths are many, but they always lead you back to the same place. I didn't know what she meant by that, not fully, but I knew one thing: I wasn't going to stop walking. Even if every path led me back here, I would keep moving. And maybe, just maybe, somewhere along the way, I would finally figure out what to do when I got back. I had always taken the same route home. It wasn't the shortest, nor the most scenic, but it was familiar, comforting, even. The same cracked pavement, the same flickering streetlights, the same low hum of distant cars. I liked the predictability of it, how the world seemed to settle into place around me as I walked. Nothing ever changed. Or so I thought. That evening, as I turned down the familiar street, I noticed the quiet was deeper than usual. The wind had died down, and even the usual distant hum of traffic was absent. The street was empty, not a soul in sight. It wasn't entirely unusual for the neighborhood to be quiet at night, but tonight, the silence felt heavy, like the city was holding its breath. I glanced around. The shops were closed, the windows dark. The usual noise of people talking, laughing, or arguing over something inconsequential was absent. I was alone. I took a few more steps, the sound of my shoes tapping against the sidewalk echoing in the stillness. The streetlights overhead hummed softly, their glow casting long shadows across the pavement. But as I continued down the street, something began to feel off. I paused, a chill running down my spine. There was no one around, no cars passing, no voices drifting from nearby houses. And yet, I could hear it, a faint, rhythmic sound, just behind me. Footsteps. Someone was walking behind me. I turned my head slightly, my eyes scanning the street, but there was nothing. No figure in the shadows, no movement in the peripheral corners of my vision. I felt my heart rate pick up, the quiet growing louder around me. Maybe it was just my imagination, I thought. Maybe I was just tired, and the stillness was playing tricks on me. But the footsteps continued. It was subtle at first, just the softest tap of shoes on pavement, so quiet that I almost convinced myself I was imagining it. But the sound grew clearer. Closer. It was behind me, matching my pace. There was no one else on the street. The street was empty. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was walking just a few steps behind me, perfectly in sync with my movements. I quickened my pace, my steps growing louder in my own ears. The sound of my feet hitting the pavement seemed to overpower the footsteps behind me for a moment, but when I slowed again, the faint tapping returned, closer this time. It was deliberate, measured, as if whoever was walking behind me was trying to keep the same distance between us. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I turned another corner, my heart racing now. I was sure someone was behind me, and the feeling was becoming unbearable. I spun around quickly, my eyes wide, expecting to see someone, anyone, standing there. But the street was as empty as before. No one. Just the same dark houses, the same empty sidewalk. The footsteps, however, didn't stop. They were still there, still following me. I began walking faster, my breaths coming in short bursts, the sound of my footsteps mingling with the strange echoing footsteps behind me. I started to run. My heart was pounding in my chest, the rhythm of my feet now chaotic, almost frantic. I glanced behind me again, expecting to see someone chasing me, but the street was still empty. No one was there. And yet, I could hear them. The footsteps. So close now, too close. I could almost feel them on my heels. I could hear the faint tap of shoes, a little too loud, a little too deliberate, to be anything other than a person, walking just behind me. I was sure of it. But when I reached the end of the street, when I spun around once more to confront whatever was following me, I was met with nothing but the dark stretch of pavement, empty and silent. I took a few unsteady steps back. My chest heaved with the effort of trying to catch my breath, my mind racing to make sense of it all. Was it possible that I was simply exhausted? That I had let my nerves get the better of me? But no, there was something unmistakable about the footsteps, something too real to ignore. My eyes scanned the street again. It was silent. Too silent. But then, from behind me, I heard it again. The footsteps. Soft at first, but then louder, more pronounced, until they were perfectly in sync with mine. I turned around sharply, my pulse pounding in my ears. Nothing. The street was still empty. The air felt still, thick, like time itself had slowed down. And then, for the briefest moment, I saw it. The shadow. The shape of someone, just in the corner of my vision. It wasn't clear at first, but as I focused on it, I saw it move. It wasn't a person, not exactly. It was darker than the shadows cast by the streetlights. A shadow of a person, with no clear form, no distinct features. And yet, I knew it was there. I stumbled backward, my heart skipping a beat. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the footsteps stopped. The silence returned. I stood there in the middle of the street, trying to steady my breathing, trying to convince myself that it was nothing, that I was simply imagining things. But the sound of those footsteps still echoed in my ears, as though they were coming from inside my head, looping over and over. The quiet around me felt suffocating, like I was waiting for something to happen. Something I wasn't prepared for. I walked home that night, my footsteps loud against the pavement, my ears straining for any hint of movement behind me. But the street remained empty. No one followed me. No more footsteps. But I knew they were still there. Somewhere. And the next night, when I walked down the same street, I could hear them again. Quiet at first, just faint taps behind me. And I realized, as I stood there, frozen in place, that the footsteps would always follow me. The street may be empty, but I would never walk alone again. I had been walking all day, wandering through the city without a particular destination. Sometimes, when I felt overwhelmed by life, I would take long walks like this to clear my head. It wasn't so much about going anywhere as it was about finding some quiet space to think, even if the city around me was anything but quiet. The sound of distant cars, the hum of conversations, the occasional honk of a horn, it all blended together into a comforting background noise, like a steady beat that kept time with my thoughts. It was late afternoon when I found myself walking down a street I didn't recognize. I had been down this way before, but the more I looked at the buildings, the more they seemed unfamiliar. It was as if they had shifted while I wasn't paying attention, or as though I had somehow wandered into a part of the city that wasn't quite real. I paused in front of a small shop, one of those quirky little places with a window full of trinkets. The sign above the door read, "Oddities and Curios," but it wasn't the sign that caught my attention. It was the window itself, or rather, what I saw through it. There was a reflection in the glass, but not just any reflection. It was me. Or rather, it was someone who looked exactly like me, only older. Much older. My heart skipped a beat as I stared at the figure, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The reflection was standing perfectly still, its face a mirror image of mine, but with lines etched deep into the skin, and the eyes, my eyes, looked different. They were filled with something I couldn't place. It was as though they had seen everything that had happened in my life, everything that I hadn't yet experienced, and yet there was something haunting in their depths, something I didn't want to acknowledge. I leaned closer to the window, my breath fogging up the glass. The figure in the reflection didn't move, didn't blink, didn't look away. It just stood there, watching me. I took a step back, my mind racing, my pulse quickening. What was happening? How could this be? I had to be imagining it. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog in my mind. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone else watching me, but the street was empty, the usual bustle of the city now strangely absent. I turned back to the window, and for a moment, I thought the reflection had changed. The older version of myself seemed closer. It was as if the reflection had stepped forward, as if it were trying to break free of the glass that separated us. The figure finally moved, and I froze. It wasn't much, just a small shift of the head, but it was enough to send a cold shiver down my spine. The reflection's eyes, my eyes, met mine, and for a brief, terrifying second, I thought I saw a flicker of recognition. It was like the person in the window knew me, knew everything about me, but in a way that was too unsettling, too unfamiliar. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in short gasps. I looked around again, wondering if someone had seen me staring at myself, but the street was still empty. I looked back at the reflection. My older self was still there, but now the figure had a slight smile on its face, one that didn't feel like mine. It was a knowing smile, as if the reflection understood something I didn't. I reached for the door handle, my hand trembling, and pushed the door open, stepping into the shop. The bell above the door jingled softly as I entered, and I took a moment to gather myself. I needed to get a grip. It was just a trick of the light, just a moment of fatigue, nothing more. The shop was dimly lit, the air thick with dust and the faint smell of something old. Shelves lined with odd knickknacks and strange trinkets filled the small room, but I barely noticed any of it. My mind was still on the reflection, the way it had stared back at me, as if waiting for me to make sense of what was happening. Behind the counter stood an older man, his gray beard and wrinkles making him look like he belonged to another time. He gave me a small smile, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice raspy but kind. I hesitated, unsure of what to say. I was just looking at the window," I said, glancing nervously over my shoulder. "I thought I saw something strange." The man's gaze shifted toward the window, and for a moment, he was silent. Then, with a sigh, he nodded slowly. "Ah," he said, as if he knew exactly what I was talking about. "You saw the reflection, didn't you?" I felt my stomach tighten. What do you mean? The man stepped closer to me, lowering his voice. That window, it shows more than just a reflection. It shows what you might become, what you might be, what's waiting for you down the road. It's different for everyone. Some people see their younger selves, some see their future selves, and some, he paused, his eyes darkening, some people don't see anything at all. I stared at him, my thoughts racing. But why? Why would I see myself like that? He shrugged, his expression unreadable. The window doesn't lie. It shows the truth. Your truth. What you'll become if you keep walking the path you're on. If you change your choices, it might change too. But it's always there, waiting, reflecting what you're heading toward. I felt a cold wave of dread wash over me. It was as if the weight of the world was suddenly pressing on my shoulders. My future self, was that really me? Was that what I was destined to become? The thought made my stomach churn, but the part that scared me the most was that I felt that I had already seen it before. The lines on my face, the way my eyes looked, it was all so familiar, as though I had already lived this moment, this conversation, this experience. I backed away slowly, my legs feeling unsteady beneath me. I don't want to know, I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. The man nodded again, as if he understood. Sometimes it's better not to know. But the window doesn't lie. It's always showing us the truth. I turned and walked quickly out of the shop, my mind swirling with confusion and fear. I didn't know what to make of it all, the reflection, the shopkeeper's words, the eerie sense of déjà vu that clung to me as I stepped back into the street. As I walked away, the thought echoed in my mind, what if my future self was already there, staring back at me, waiting for me to recognize it? What if every choice I made led me to that moment, to that version of myself, and I couldn't stop it? I looked around, but the street was still the same, the city unchanged. I felt the weight of the world on my shoulders, but as I glanced at the windows I passed, I couldn't help but wonder if I would see my reflection again, if it would follow me, always just a few steps behind, waiting for me to catch up. And, just as the thought crossed my mind, I looked into the next window I passed. There it was again. My older self. Staring back at me. But this time, there was no smile. Only the same knowing gaze. And I realized then, this was the path I was already on. I had been walking for what felt like hours, but the city around me seemed unchanged. The same steady hum of life filled the air, people walking by, cars passing, the distant chatter of voices. It was one of those evenings where I was too tired to focus on anything specific, my thoughts just floating in and out, waiting for the day to end. I didn't have anywhere in particular to be, I was just letting my feet carry me wherever they pleased. The street I was on, though, felt strangely quiet, even though I knew I had walked down it a dozen times before. I don't know why I stopped at the small park, but something made me slow my pace as I neared the entrance. The path through the park was bordered by trees that had begun to lose their leaves, the ground littered with dry remnants of autumn. A few benches were scattered along the trail, some occupied, others empty. The sky above was gray, with the last traces of sunlight fading quickly, leaving the park cast in a dim, almost muted light. I sat on one of the benches, just to rest for a while. My phone was dead, and I had left my headphones at home, so I simply sat there in the quiet, letting the cool evening air surround me. The park was peaceful, but there was something off about it tonight, as though the world was holding its breath. The sound of distant laughter from the nearby street felt muffled, like a memory fading away. I was about to stand up and keep walking when I noticed her. She was standing by the far side of the park, just past the large oak tree. She was alone, her figure distinct in the growing dimness of the evening. I didn't know why, but something about her caught my attention. She wasn't particularly striking, just a woman in her mid-30s, with dark hair and a loose-fitting coat, standing still like she was waiting for something. Or maybe waiting for someone. I stared at her for a moment longer than I should have, unsure of why she felt out of place. She hadn't noticed me. But just as I was about to look away, our eyes met. I can't explain it. It was like time stopped for a fraction of a second. Her gaze was direct, unblinking. I expected her to look away or acknowledge me, but instead, she just stared. There was something unsettling about it, something cold. Not in a way that was immediately frightening, but in a way that left me feeling exposed, like I was being studied. She wasn't frowning or smiling, her face was neutral, but her eyes were too still. I shifted uncomfortably on the bench, but I couldn't look away. Something about the way she held my gaze was magnetic, drawing me in, and yet at the same time, I felt like I needed to pull back, to break the connection. I blinked, hoping it would snap me out of the strange trance I felt like I was in. But she didn't blink. Her eyes remained wide open, unblinking, as if she were frozen in place. Her stare felt so unnatural, so unnerving, that I could almost feel it crawling under my skin. I shifted again, my fingers gripping the edge of the bench as I forced myself to look away. It was a mistake to stare at her for so long. I shouldn't have lingered. The longer I thought about it, the more uncomfortable I became. I glanced up at the trees, at the empty benches, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. But even as I did, I couldn't shake the thought that she was still looking at me, her eyes fixed and unmoving. I turned back, almost afraid to meet her gaze again, but when I looked, she was still there. And still, she hadn't blinked. Her eyes, wide and empty, never faltered. The longer I stared, the more I could see the faint shimmer of reflection in her pupils, like there was something beneath the surface of her gaze, something lurking, just out of reach. I couldn't tell what it was, but it felt wrong. A chill ran down my spine. It was like she was staring not at me, but through me, as if I wasn't really there. I felt myself growing uneasy, my heart beginning to race as a strange sensation spread through my chest. It was like the air had thickened, becoming heavier, harder to breathe. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but my body didn't obey. I sat frozen, unable to move, unable to look away. And then, as if sensing the shift in my thoughts, she began to move. Slowly, methodically, her feet taking small steps forward, still staring at me with those unblinking eyes. My throat went dry. I couldn't speak, couldn't call for help. My body was paralyzed by the force of her gaze. She was coming toward me now, her steps deliberate, measured, as if she were walking a path she had walked 1,000 times before. And as she drew closer, I realized with a sudden jolt of terror that I didn't know what she wanted. What was she waiting for? Why hadn't she blinked? Why wasn't she human in the way I understood it? I stood up abruptly, the bench scraping loudly against the ground as I backed away, but even as I moved, my eyes stayed locked on hers. She kept walking toward me, her pace never quickening, her gaze unwavering. I turned and started walking away, my steps quick and frantic, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't hear her footsteps. I couldn't hear anything. But somehow, I knew she was still there, still watching, still following me. I reached the edge of the park, my breath shallow, the fear coiling tighter in my chest with every step I took. When I glanced over my shoulder, I expected to see her standing at the park entrance, just beyond the gates, still staring at me. But when I looked, the park was empty. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting long shadows across the path, but she was nowhere in sight. I don't know when I stopped running, but by the time I reached the corner, I felt the tension in my chest begin to loosen. The fear, the strange paralysis, began to fade, but the memory of her eyes, those unblinking eyes, stayed with me, lodged in my mind. It had only been a few minutes, but it felt like hours. When I got home, I tried to shake it off. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just an odd encounter, a trick of the light, maybe. But I knew it wasn't. I knew something had happened that I couldn't explain. That night, as I lay in bed, the silence of the room pressing in around me, I kept seeing her eyes. The way they never blinked, the way they locked onto me, filled with something I couldn't place. And even as I drifted off to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still out there, somewhere, watching me with those unblinking eyes. Waiting. And no matter how much I told myself it was over, I knew I couldn't escape her gaze. Not really. It would always be there, just out of reach, staring back at me, unblinking. It was a long day, the kind that wears you down even before it ends. I had stayed late at the office, working on a project that didn't seem to have any end in sight. The commute home was supposed to be the usual, quiet, uneventful. I took the subway every day, a route I knew like the back of my hand. Same car, same seat, same rhythm of the train rattling through the tunnels. It was a predictable routine that didn't demand much thought. But tonight, the train felt different. I stepped into the subway car and found a seat by the window, as I always did. The same familiar faces sat across from me, all buried in their own worlds, heads down, eyes on phones, earbuds in. There was a tiredness in the air, a collective exhaustion that seemed to seep into the very walls of the train. I glanced at the map on the wall above the doors, the yellow lines marking my route. I was headed home, just a few stops away, the evening stretching out ahead of me with nothing more than the usual tired rituals. The train jerked to life, and I leaned back, watching the city blur past through the smudged window. The familiar hum of the tracks beneath the train was almost soothing. The world outside, dark and fleeting, passed by like a string of disconnected moments. I closed my eyes for a second, letting the motion of the train rock me gently, trying to release the tension that had settled in my shoulders. But then, just as I was about to drift off, the train slowed. It wasn't the gradual deceleration I had become accustomed to, no, this was sudden, jerking, as if the train had hit an invisible wall. The noise of the tracks grinding to a halt echoed through the car, jarring me back to reality. I opened my eyes, looking around. The other passengers hadn't noticed the abrupt stop. They remained frozen in their seats, staring ahead as though nothing had happened. I glanced out the window. The tunnel ahead of us was dark, as it always was, but this time, something seemed off. The darkness wasn't just the absence of light, it felt infinite, like it stretched on beyond the limits of the train, beyond any sense of space. The dim lights above flickered, casting long shadows across the car. I pressed my face against the glass, trying to peer into the blackness ahead. I couldn't see the end of the tunnel. There was no light at the far end, no sign of the next station. It was as if the tracks themselves had vanished into a bottomless abyss. My breath caught in my throat. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the unease creeping into my chest. Maybe the train had broken down. Maybe it was just a technical glitch. I glanced around again. Everyone in the car was still silent, motionless. The sound of the train's motor was gone, leaving only the eerie silence of the tunnel. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The sensation of being utterly alone in the dark was almost overwhelming. I stood up, unsure of what to do, and moved toward the door, my shoes scraping softly on the floor. I reached for the emergency button to alert the conductor, but before I could touch it, the train lurched forward again, starting to move, slowly at first, then gradually picking up speed. I sank back into my seat, my heart still racing. But even as the train began moving again, something didn't feel right. The darkness outside didn't change, didn't fade. It remained as endless and oppressive as before, like the tunnel was swallowing the train whole. I stared out the window again, feeling that familiar sense of unease return. The train kept moving. The city above was long gone, replaced by nothing but shadows and emptiness. I checked my watch. 5 minutes had passed since the train had stopped. But the feeling of being stuck in an eternal void was growing, gnawing at the back of my mind. I leaned forward, staring at the map on the wall. We were supposed to be heading toward my stop. But the map didn't seem right now. The lines, which had always been so clear to me, now looked strange, twisted, distorted, like they no longer mapped a real city, but something else. The stops blurred together, and the words had started to shift, becoming unreadable, as though they were fading into the background of the train itself. I tried to calm myself. I tried to reason with the irrational panic creeping up my spine. Maybe I was just exhausted. Maybe the shadows outside were playing tricks on me, making the tunnel seem infinite when it was just the same old route I'd taken 100 times. But the train didn't stop. The tracks kept going. I counted the seconds as they stretched into minutes. 10 minutes passed, then 20, then 30. We were moving, but we weren't getting anywhere. There was no sign of any station. The sound of the train, once rhythmic and comforting, now felt hollow, like the train was gliding through an endless void. The city was gone, and so was time. All I could hear was the hum of the train, growing louder, vibrating through the floor, through my chest, through my very bones. I tried to look at the other passengers again. But their faces, once familiar, now seemed distant and strange. They didn't look at me, didn't acknowledge anything. They were still, frozen, like mannequins. I could feel my chest tightening, the air growing thick. The quiet was maddening. And still, the track stretched on, endlessly, as though the train would never stop. My fingers curled around the armrest, and I pressed my face against the glass, desperate to see something, anything. The lights flickered again, then went completely dark. The train continued moving through the endless, oppressive void. And then, as if in response to my growing panic, I heard something, a sound, faint at first, barely audible over the hum of the train. Footsteps. I froze. They were soft at first, almost imperceptible, but then they grew louder, coming from somewhere behind me. My heart skipped a beat. I turned around, expecting to see someone walking down the aisle, but there was nothing. The car remained empty. The footsteps didn't stop, though. They were still there, slow, steady, echoing from the back of the train. I stood up again, trembling now. My mind was racing. The sound of those footsteps was growing closer, more distinct, more deliberate. I felt my breath catch in my throat. Something wasn't right. It wasn't just the endless tunnel, the distorted map, or the frozen passengers. There was something on the train with me. Someone else. I turned to face the aisle, my feet unwilling to move. I couldn't see anyone, but the footsteps were unmistakable. They were right behind me now, almost too close to ignore. And then, I heard a voice. A soft, raspy whisper that felt like it came from nowhere, from everywhere at once. "You'll never leave." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. The footsteps stopped. And I realized then, there was no destination. No end. The tracks, the train, the city, it was all a loop. An endless loop, stretching on forever. And I would never reach the end. The train kept moving, and the tracks went on. And I knew, deep down, that it would never stop. It was an ordinary day when I first found it. The kind of day where everything is just background noise, where your mind floats in and out of tasks without you even noticing. I had been running errands, the usual sort of thing, buying groceries, paying bills, checking off a list. My phone buzzed in my pocket as I walked down the street, and I fished it out, scrolling quickly through my messages as I moved through the crowd. I wasn't paying much attention to what I was doing, just going through the motions. I was halfway through the grocery store when I felt it, something in my pocket that didn't belong. At first, I thought it was just a crumpled receipt or a forgotten piece of paper. But when I pulled it out, I saw that it was a photograph. I didn't recognize it. The picture was small, weathered at the edges, like it had been sitting in my pocket for a long time. It was a photo of me, or someone who looked like me, standing on a street I didn't recognize. The setting looked familiar, but I couldn't place it. It was a narrow alley, dimly lit, with old brick buildings on either side. There was a lamppost in the background, glowing softly, casting long shadows across the cobblestone road. The colors were muted, as if the photo had been taken in the late afternoon or evening. And then there was me. I looked different. Younger, maybe? But not just that. There was a look on my face that I didn't recognize. It wasn't a smile, not really. It was more like a knowing glance, as if I was aware of something that I couldn't remember now. The person in the photo wasn't smiling, but the eyes, they were familiar, but they weren't my eyes. They looked distant, like they had seen something unsettling, something I couldn't recall. I stared at it for a moment, trying to make sense of it. My heart began to beat a little faster. I didn't remember taking the photo. In fact, I couldn't remember anything about that moment. The place was unfamiliar to me, the people weren't anyone I knew, and yet the photo felt real. Like it had always been there, in my pocket, just waiting for me to find it. I checked the back of the photograph, half expecting to find a date or a name or something to help me understand why it was in my possession. But there was nothing. No words, no clue. Just the image, frozen in time, a part of a story that didn't make any sense. I shoved the photo back into my pocket, trying to ignore the tightness in my chest. It was probably just a mistake, I told myself. Maybe it had gotten mixed up with my things somehow, maybe it was from a time I didn't remember. But the more I thought about it, the more I felt an odd sense of discomfort. It wasn't just the picture itself, it was the feeling that came with it, the sense that I had forgotten something important, something I was meant to know. Later that night, I tried to ignore the nagging feeling in my mind. I went about my usual routine, watching TV, scrolling through my phone, trying to push the photo out of my thoughts. But as the evening wore on, the photo kept coming back to me. The more I tried to forget it, the clearer the details became. The way the lamppost in the photo looked, the way the cobblestone road seemed to stretch on forever, the way the sky above seemed just a little too dark. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been there before. I had walked that street. I had seen that lamppost. But I didn't know when, and I didn't know why. Finally, unable to take it anymore, I pulled the photo out again, my fingers trembling as I looked at it once more. I stared at the alley, the soft glow of the lamppost, and then at myself. And that's when I saw it. There was something in the background of the photo that I hadn't noticed before. A figure, half hidden in the shadows, standing just at the edge of the alley. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, or maybe some artifact of the photo itself. But the more I looked, the more I realized it was a person, a man, his face obscured by the darkness, but his outline unmistakable. He was watching me. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I didn't recognize him. And yet, I felt the same sense of knowing I had felt when I first looked at the photo. There was something familiar about him, something about the way he stood there, as if he had been waiting for me to notice. As if he had always been there, watching. I flipped the photo over again, desperate for some clue, some explanation. But there was nothing. Just the blank back of the photo, smooth and featureless. I put the photo down on the table and stepped back, feeling a sense of unease settle over me. I needed answers. I needed to know where that photo had come from, why it had been in my pocket, and why I couldn't remember taking it. But every time I tried to make sense of it, the feeling only grew stronger, like I was being pulled into something I couldn't escape. I went to bed that night, but sleep didn't come easily. The image of the photo, of that man in the shadows, haunted me. I tried to distract myself, turning on my side, pulling the covers tighter around me, but the more I tried to push it out of my mind, the more vivid the image became. His figure, standing at the edge of the alley, waiting. Watching. I awoke in the middle of the night, my eyes snapping open. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was. The room was dark, the only sound the soft hum of the city outside. I glanced around, trying to shake off the lingering unease from the dream. And then I noticed it. The photo was gone. I searched the room, checking the bedside table, the drawers, my pockets, but it was nowhere to be found. I didn't understand. I hadn't moved it. I hadn't touched it since the last time I looked at it. And yet, it was gone. My heart started to race. I tried to calm myself, tried to reason that maybe I had misplaced it or that I had left it in another room. But deep down, I knew. It wasn't just the photo that was gone. It was the memory of it. The details were starting to slip away from me, like grains of sand running through my fingers. The alley, the lamppost, the man in the shadows, they were all becoming blurry, fading into something I couldn't quite reach. The more I tried to recall it, the more it slipped away. I got up, desperate to find it, to hold on to it. But when I opened the drawer, when I checked every corner of my apartment, the only thing I found was that strange, empty feeling, the kind of feeling you get when something important has been erased from your mind, like a dream that fades as soon as you wake up. And in that moment, I realized something unsettling. Maybe the photo was never mine to begin with. Maybe it had never been in my pocket. Maybe it had always been there to remind me of something I was supposed to forget. I didn't know what was happening, but I felt it in my bones. I wasn't supposed to remember. I looked around the room once more, feeling the weight of the darkness pressing in around me. But the more I searched, the more I realized that it wasn't the photo I needed to find. It was the memory of it. And that, I was certain, was something I would never be able to hold on to again. It was a typical Wednesday afternoon. The city was bustling with the usual rhythm, people hurrying from one place to the next, the distant honking of cars, the murmur of voices blending together into a kind of background hum. I had just finished a meeting and was making my way through the crowded square, trying to get to the subway entrance. I wasn't in a hurry, but I wanted to avoid the peak rush, so I kept my head down, weaving between pedestrians as I walked, lost in my thoughts. As I passed a small cafe on the corner, something made me stop. There was a woman standing just outside the door, waiting for her coffee. I didn't think much of her at first, just another person in the crowd. But as I looked up, I found myself looking directly at her, and in that split second, something about her felt different. Her eyes locked with mine. It wasn't just a glance. It was a connection, a brief but intense moment where I felt like she could see straight through me. Her expression was calm, almost knowing, like she had been waiting for me to notice her. She didn't smile, didn't look away, just stood there, her gaze fixed on me as the world moved on around us. The street kept pulsing with life, people walking past, cars driving by, but in that moment, nothing seemed to exist except the two of us. I stood frozen for a few seconds, my heart beating faster for reasons I couldn't explain. Her eyes were so familiar, yet I knew I had never seen her before. It was as if I recognized her from a dream, or from some distant past I couldn't quite grasp. I opened my mouth to say something, but before I could form the words, she turned away. The woman stepped inside the cafe, disappearing through the door with the same calm, deliberate pace she had when she first caught my gaze. The moment she crossed the threshold, everything returned to normal. The sounds of the city, the movement of the crowd, they all rushed back into focus. But something inside me felt different, like I had been shaken awake from a dream that I couldn't remember. I kept walking toward the subway entrance, my mind still on her, on those eyes. I tried to shake it off, but it clung to me, that strange feeling of recognition that wouldn't leave. As I descended into the underground station, I thought I heard something. A voice. It was soft, almost like a whisper, but it cut through the noise of the station, the distant rumble of the trains, the chatter of commuters. It was her voice. Clear, calm, but somehow distant, as though it were floating above the noise. Don't forget me. I stopped in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. The station was crowded, people rushing to catch their trains, but I felt like I was frozen in time. I glanced around, searching for the source of the voice. But no one was paying attention to me. No one seemed to notice anything out of the ordinary. I shook my head, trying to convince myself that it was just the stress of the day playing tricks on my mind. But the voice, her voice, kept echoing in my ears. "Don't forget me." I couldn't ignore it. It felt too real. It was as if she were still there, her presence lingering in the air around me. I wanted to turn around, to run back up to the cafe and find her, but something held me in place. A strange, unshakable sense that if I did, I might lose whatever thread of connection I had just experienced. I boarded the subway, the hum of the train filling the space around me. I found a seat by the window and sat down, still unnerved, still listening for the voice that didn't belong in this crowded train. As the train pulled out of the station, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That something was with me, hovering just out of sight. The voice continued. It was quieter now, more like a thought that I couldn't ignore. "Remember." I closed my eyes, trying to block it out. But the words were persistent, clinging to my thoughts, following me wherever I went. It wasn't just a voice anymore, it felt like a presence, like someone was watching me, waiting for me to understand. I tried to focus on the people around me, on the chatter, on the rhythm of the train, but I couldn't. My mind kept drifting back to her. To the woman. To her eyes and the way she had looked at me, like she knew me, like she was trying to tell me something, something I was supposed to understand. The train pulled into my stop, and I stood up, my legs feeling like lead. I stepped out onto the platform, my heart still racing. The crowds were moving in every direction, but all I could think about was the voice. The feeling of her presence still lingering in the air, like a weight I couldn't shake off. I hurried up the stairs to the street, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling that had taken root in my chest. I walked home in a daze, the city around me moving at its usual pace, but I felt like I was detached from it, like I was moving through a dream I couldn't escape. When I finally got home, I collapsed onto the couch, exhausted, but still unable to get the woman out of my mind. Her eyes, her voice, the way she had looked at me, I couldn't forget it. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts spinning. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, that I was missing something important, something crucial. But what? And then, in the stillness of the room, I heard it again. "Don't forget me." It wasn't a whisper this time. It was clear, unmistakable. The voice was in the room with me, right next to me, as if she were standing there, watching me. I bolted upright, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was empty. Still. Silent. But the voice stayed with me, echoing in my mind, haunting me. It was as if she was calling me, asking me to remember something I couldn't quite grasp. Something I wasn't supposed to forget. I spent the rest of the night tossing and turning, the voice never leaving me, growing louder, more insistent. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't escape it. The next day, I returned to the cafe. I didn't know why. It wasn't like I had any real reason to, but something deep inside me urged me to go. I walked into the familiar space, the bell above the door ringing softly as I entered. The barista looked up from behind the counter, but when I looked around, I didn't see her. The woman wasn't there. I asked the barista, my voice shaky, "Has anyone come in here today?" A woman, with dark hair, maybe about my age. The barista gave me a confused look. "I'm sorry, no. You're the first customer today." I turned around and left the cafe, my chest tight. I walked down the street, past the lamppost where I had first seen her, but nothing felt the same anymore. The city, once so familiar, now seemed alien, as if I were walking through a place that didn't quite exist. And yet, as I walked away, I still heard it. That voice. In the back of my mind. Remember me. I couldn't shake it. I couldn't forget her. And I realized, with an icy chill running through me, that maybe she had never been a stranger. Maybe I had known her all along. It was late when I left the cafe, the air cooler than it had been earlier in the day, a quiet chill that made me pull my jacket tighter around my shoulders. The city was still alive, but there was a certain stillness to it now, fewer people, the streets emptying out as the night deepened. I could hear the faint hum of distant traffic, the occasional murmur of voices from the bars and restaurants I passed, but mostly, it was just the sound of my footsteps echoing in the empty street. I walked down the familiar route home, a well-worn path that had become as second nature to me as breathing. I was lost in thought, my mind wandering to the events of the day, the faces I had seen, the words I had spoken. It was a normal night, a normal walk, and yet, something felt off. The first sign of it came when I reached the first streetlight. It flickered, a brief, rhythmic stutter in the glow before it settled back into its usual dim illumination. I barely noticed at first, just a quick flash of uncertainty that I dismissed as nothing. But as I walked further, I noticed it again, a second flicker, this time from the streetlight ahead. It buzzed, and then went out completely. I stopped in my tracks, glancing around. The street was dark now, just a patch of pale light around me from the dying streetlight behind me, casting long, exaggerated shadows along the pavement. I felt a moment of unease, the kind of unease that creeps up your spine without you even realizing why. I started walking again, my steps a little quicker, a little sharper. As I passed under the next streetlight, it too flickered, then dimmed before shutting off completely. A chill ran through me, stronger this time. The shadows felt different, darker, deeper, as if they were stretching out further than they should have been, as though the darkness itself was starting to encroach upon the light. By the time I reached the third streetlight, I could see that it too had turned off, the night growing thicker with each step. I stopped again, a little panic rising in my chest. I glanced up at the lights, willing them to flicker back on, to give me that familiar warmth, but the streets ahead of me were completely dark now, save for the dim glow of the fading lights behind me. My breath quickened, but I forced myself to keep walking. This was silly, I told myself. It was just the lights. Just a glitch in the system. But as I walked, the unease gnawed at me, and the darkness around me deepened. I reached the next intersection and noticed something strange. The lights on the other side of the street were still on, their yellow glow bathing the sidewalk in a soft light, but on my side of the street? Only shadows. I turned a corner, trying to shake off the feeling, but that's when I saw it, my shadow. It was stretched out in front of me, longer than it should have been, as though it was reaching further into the darkness. The oddest thing was that it was still clearly visible. The streetlights were out, but my shadow, standing clearly on the pavement, was there. It was as if the light hadn't gone out at all, as if the darkness around me had simply decided to leave my shadow alone. I stopped dead in my tracks, my pulse racing. My heart pounded in my ears as I stared at the shadow. It was wrong. It was too sharp, too defined, standing clearly against the darkened sidewalk. I looked up. There were no lights anywhere near me. There was no reason my shadow should have been so vivid, so alive. I took a few hesitant steps forward, and as I did, the shadow stretched even longer, trailing behind me like a dark companion. It was as though it was following me, but it wasn't exactly the same as my own movements. It seemed to move a beat too slow, like it was mimicking me, or rather, waiting for me to take my next step before it decided to shift. I started walking faster, my steps almost frantic now, and the shadow kept pace, as if it were an extension of myself. But it wasn't my shadow anymore. I couldn't explain it, but the longer I looked at it, the more detached it seemed from me. It was as if it had its own intent, its own presence. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone behind me, someone lurking in the dark. But no one was there. The street was empty, and the world around me seemed strangely quiet. The only sound was the echo of my footsteps, now quickening in pace as I tried to outrun the growing discomfort that was steadily creeping into my bones. I reached another intersection and saw the same pattern, no lights. The street ahead of me was a yawning chasm of blackness, stretching endlessly into the night, with my shadow still trailing behind me. I tried to walk faster, but my feet felt heavy, like I was wading through the dark itself, fighting against something unseen. It was when I reached the alley that I stopped. The air felt different here, thick, suffocating. My shadow stood stark against the alleyway wall, stretched impossibly long. But this time, it wasn't just my shadow anymore. There was something else in it. A darker, more twisted version of me, moving slightly differently, as though it had a mind of its own. I backed away, but the shadow on the wall didn't. It stretched even further, its edges curling, twisting like smoke, as if it wanted to break free from the confines of the pavement, to become something else. I turned around to leave the alley, but the moment I moved, I felt it, a presence, right behind me. The air was heavy, pressing in on me, and my feet felt sluggish, like the ground was pulling me back, reluctant to let me escape. I spun around again, my breath caught in my throat. The shadow remained. Still. Unmoving. But something else was wrong, something even worse than before. I could feel it now, a whisper in the air, a voice that didn't speak, but instead echoed in my mind. "You can't leave." My heart froze, and I took a step back. The shadow seemed to ripple, to stretch even further now, its outline indistinct and fluid. It didn't belong to me anymore. It had become something else entirely, something that was bound to me, but not of me. I took one last desperate step back, trying to flee, but my shadow, it didn't follow me. It stayed behind, but the sensation of it being there with me lingered. I bolted from the alley, my mind reeling, trying to make sense of everything, but as I ran, the feeling of being watched never left me. No matter how fast I ran, no matter how far I went, I knew that my shadow would stay behind. And whatever it was, whatever that thing had become, it would never let me forget. I couldn't outrun it. It was a part of me now, a presence that lingered in the dark, and I knew I could never escape it. And as I reached the safety of my apartment, I looked out of my window, my breath shaky, and saw it again. My shadow, stretched out before me, waiting. I had walked that bridge countless times before, never giving it a second thought. It was just another part of my daily commute, one of the few constants in my routine. The bridge itself wasn't anything remarkable, just a steel structure, aged with time, that spanned the river between two parts of the city. On one side was the busy downtown area, full of office buildings, shops, and the constant hum of activity. On the other, the quieter residential district, with old houses, parks, and narrow streets where people seemed to move at a slower pace. But on that particular day, everything felt different. Maybe it was the weather, overcast skies, the air thick with the possibility of rain, or maybe it was the strange unease I felt as I stepped onto the bridge, but something wasn't right. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. Everything looked the same, there were the same old railings on either side, the same tired pavement beneath my feet, the same view of the city skyline in the distance. And yet, it felt like the bridge wasn't quite where it should be. I kept walking, my shoes clicking softly against the concrete, trying to push the odd feeling aside. But the more I walked, the more it grew, this sense of wrongness in the air, like I was drifting off course without realizing it. I glanced up, taking in the view, and that's when I saw it. The other side of the bridge, the one I had just crossed from, looked closer. It hadn't been that close when I first started. The distance between the two sides of the bridge had always been the same, but now it seemed as though the city was pulling itself together, shrinking, closing in on me. I paused for a moment, confused, my gaze shifting between the two sides. I couldn't quite make sense of it. Maybe I had just been walking too long, or maybe it was the fog that had begun to creep in, turning everything around me blurry. I took another step, telling myself to shake it off, to keep going. I was almost halfway across the bridge now, and I knew the worst thing I could do was overthink it. But then, just as I was about to resume my walk, something strange happened. The bridge stopped feeling like the same bridge. I couldn't tell when it happened, but suddenly the steel railings on my left side didn't look as familiar. They were more rusted than I remembered, as though they had aged years in the span of a few moments. The worn pavement beneath my feet seemed to have changed too, rougher now, cracked in places where it had once been smooth. It wasn't a gradual change, like the bridge was falling apart, but something that felt deeper, like I had crossed into another place, a place I wasn't supposed to be. I turned around, looking back toward the side I had just come from, and saw the skyline I was familiar with, the tall office buildings, the busy streets, still there. But everything felt distant now, further away, as though the bridge had stretched too long, and the city on the other side had faded out of reach. It was at that moment I realized something was terribly wrong. I started walking again, but my pace quickened. It wasn't out of fear, not exactly. It was just that the sense of wrongness had become undeniable. Every step felt heavier, as if the bridge itself was pulling me forward, forcing me to keep moving, but I wasn't sure where I was going. The fog was thicker now, swirling around me, and the sounds of the city, once so clear, began to fade, drowned out by the sound of my own footsteps. I wasn't sure how long I had been walking. It felt like minutes, but also like hours. The more I moved, the further I felt from both sides of the bridge, as though I was drifting in some liminal space between two worlds, neither fully real. And then, when I reached the other side, the end of the bridge, or so I thought, I stopped dead in my tracks. It was the same side. The side I had started from. The buildings were the same, the street corner just as familiar, the same dull glow of the streetlights. The bridge behind me now looked exactly the way it had when I first stepped onto it. My heart began to race. I turned back, half expecting to see the other side, the one I had just crossed toward, but it wasn't there. The fog had swallowed it. There was no sign of the skyline, no trace of the city on the opposite side. Just the same side I had come from, stretching out before me. I walked back to the bridge, trying to understand what had happened. I had crossed it. I was sure of it. But now, standing here on the same side I had started from, I couldn't make sense of it. I looked back toward the city, trying to reorient myself, but everything felt like it was shifting, like I had moved through some kind of thin veil and crossed into a version of the world where time and space didn't work the way they were supposed to. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, and stepped onto the bridge again. The moment my foot hit the pavement, I felt that same strange pull. It was as though the bridge was urging me forward, drawing me along, even though I knew the destination ahead of me didn't exist. I kept walking, but the further I went, the more the world around me seemed to change, as if the distance between what I knew and what I was experiencing was stretching. The city beyond the bridge had become a vague silhouette now, blurry and out of focus. I tried to turn back again, but the feeling was unmistakable. The bridge stretched endlessly, without beginning or end. I had crossed it, and yet, I was still on the same side. I didn't look back. There was nothing to look back at anymore. The city, the streets, the buildings, they weren't the same. But neither was the bridge. And I realized, with an unsettling certainty, that I would never reach the other side. Because there was no other side. The bridge wasn't going anywhere. It was just looping, drawing me into a place that didn't exist. I took another step, and the world seemed to shift again. The distance between me and the city continued to grow, but this time, I couldn't stop myself. I couldn't turn around. The bridge had already taken me somewhere. But I was stuck, moving forward, even though I hadn't moved at all. And I knew, then, that the bridge was never meant to be crossed. It wasn't meant to take me anywhere. It was meant to keep me here, forever. It was late afternoon when I first saw her, standing on the corner near the park. I had been walking for a while, distracted by my thoughts, the weight of the day pressing down on my shoulders. I was unfamiliar with the neighborhood, having just moved into a new apartment a few days ago, but I had figured that wandering around would help me get my bearings. I had been exploring the streets near the park, taking in the unfamiliar sights, old buildings, little cafes, narrow alleys, and just trying to find some peace of mind after a long week. When I noticed her, I thought at first she was just another passerby, standing on the sidewalk with a bag of groceries. She was older than me, maybe in her mid-50s, her graying hair pulled back in a loose bun, her coat heavy against the cool air. But there was something about the way she was standing, so still, almost too still, that caught my attention. She wasn't looking at anyone in particular, just standing there as if she was waiting for something or someone. As I walked past her, I heard her voice. "Excuse me," she called out, her tone soft but clear. I turned, half expecting her to ask for directions, but instead, she gave me a small, almost apologetic smile. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said, "but I think you're looking for something." I hesitated, unsure of how to respond. I hadn't told anyone I was looking for anything, but somehow her words made me stop. There was something in her eyes, a knowingness, as if she could see right through me. "I don't know what you mean," I said, trying to brush it off as some odd coincidence. But she didn't back down. She looked at me with that same quiet certainty, as if waiting for me to say something else. "Do you need directions?" she asked, her voice gentle but insistent. For a moment, I considered walking away. I didn't want to get caught up in some random encounter with a stranger, but something about her felt familiar. Not in the way you recognize someone from your past, but in the way you know when something is meant to happen, even if you can't explain why. "Actually," I said, almost without thinking, "I'm still trying to figure out my way around here. I just moved in." She nodded, a slight smile on her lips. "I thought so. I can help you," she said. Then, with a strange confidence, she added, "It's not far. You'll be fine, just follow my directions carefully." I raised an eyebrow, still unsure. "I just need to get to the corner of Maple and 3rd, I said, naming the street that I had been trying to find. She smiled again, the same calm, knowing smile. "Oh, that's easy. Turn right at the next street, go down 3 blocks, and you'll see it. But you'll want to look closely, it's easy to miss if you're not paying attention." I nodded, still skeptical, but thankful for the guidance. I figured I'd follow her directions and see where it led. I thanked her and began to walk away, turning onto the next street as she had instructed. But as I walked, I began to feel a strange sense of unease. The buildings around me looked different than I remembered. They were older, the architecture more intricate, as if I had stepped back in time. The streetlights overhead flickered in a way that made me feel like I was walking through a dream. I kept my head down, trying to focus on my steps, but the city felt unfamiliar, the air colder somehow. As I reached the 3rd block, just as she had said, I realized I hadn't seen any street signs, no indication that I was anywhere near Maple and 3rd. The streets were empty, eerily so, and the sounds of the city felt muffled, distant. I looked around, confusion tightening in my chest. This wasn't where I thought I was. I tried to calm myself. Maybe I had missed the turn. Maybe I had gotten lost. I turned back to retrace my steps, but everything around me seemed different. The alleyways I had passed earlier were now closed off, the sidewalks narrower, the buildings taller and more crumbling. There were no signs of life, no people, nothing that felt like the neighborhood I had walked through earlier. And that's when I noticed it. At the end of the street stood an old, rusted iron gate. It was strange because I didn't remember seeing it before. It wasn't there when I had first passed through. The gate seemed out of place, like it belonged in a different time, and a strange compulsion rose in me to walk toward it. I tried to shake off the unease, but my feet moved as if on their own accord, carrying me toward the gate. The air grew colder with every step, and as I reached for the rusted bars, I felt a chill run through me. I shouldn't be here, I thought. But still, I stepped through the gate, crossing into what felt like an entirely different world. On the other side was a narrow path lined with overgrown hedges. The path twisted and turned, disappearing into the trees ahead. It was quiet. Too quiet. I could hear the distant sound of water running somewhere nearby, but nothing else. No birds, no people, no traffic, just the whisper of the wind in the trees. I walked, unsure of where I was going, the path growing darker with each step. The trees around me seemed to press in closer, and the light began to fade, as if the world was closing in around me. I felt that same feeling of being watched, of something just out of sight, lurking behind the trees. Finally, I reached the end of the path, where it opened up to a small, forgotten house. It looked abandoned, the windows boarded up, the paint peeling from the walls. The house was old, older than anything I had seen before. The door was slightly ajar, as though waiting for me to enter. And just as I stood there, frozen in place, the voice from earlier echoed in my mind. "Don't forget to look closely," it whispered. "It's easy to miss if you're not paying attention." The voice was the same, the one I had heard from the woman on the street. Only now, it felt different. More insistent. More real. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open, stepping inside. The room beyond was dark, save for a single beam of light that filtered through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. I stepped further into the house, the air thick with dust and age. And that's when I saw it, the photograph on the mantelpiece. It was a picture of me. But I didn't recognize it. I didn't remember ever taking it. I stared at the photo, my heart pounding in my chest. The image was familiar, *2 familiar. It was the exact same street I had been walking on earlier, but with one difference. In the photo, I was standing there, just as I had in reality, but with a woman by my side. The same woman who had given me directions. She was smiling in the photo, looking directly at the camera with that same knowing look in her eyes. And for the first time, I realized something terrifying. I wasn't lost. I had been here before. And the path I had followed wasn't just a street, it was a loop, a circle. I had been brought here, to this place I had never seen, but in reality, had always known. And just as I turned to leave, the door behind me closed with a soft, final click. I was trapped. The path had led me here, and now, there was no way out. I had never thought much of the city's quiet corners. The places where the hustle and bustle faded into the background, and the usual noise of life became a mere hum. I always preferred the busy streets, the crowds, the energy of movement and sound. But that day, something shifted. Maybe it was the way the light fell on the sidewalks, or the way the air felt heavier, thicker with the weight of things unsaid. But when I stepped off the main street, onto the narrow alley that led to my apartment, I felt the silence seep into me. It felt like it was wrapping around me, holding me, like I was being drawn into something that I couldn't quite see. The city had always been alive with sound, honking horns, people shouting across the street, the distant whir of a subway train beneath the pavement. But that afternoon, as I made my way through the alley, there was only the faintest whisper of wind, and the soft scrape of my shoes against the uneven sidewalk. I paused at the corner, glancing up at the buildings on either side. The buildings here were older, the brickwork faded and chipped, but there was something charming about them, something that made me feel grounded. The street was deserted, and the silence seemed unnatural. It wasn't the absence of sound I had grown used to in the quieter parts of the city, it was something else. Something heavier. The kind of silence that presses down on you, makes you feel like you're not supposed to be here. I took a step forward, and it was then that I first noticed it. The sound of my own footsteps. It wasn't unusual for me to hear my steps echoing in a quiet alley, but today, it felt different. The sound was louder, sharper, reverberating through the narrow passage. As I walked, I couldn't help but notice that the echo didn't fade the way it normally would. It lingered, stretching out behind me like a shadow. I quickened my pace, thinking it was just my imagination. But the faster I walked, the louder the echo grew, until it was as if the sound of my steps was chasing me, following me with each stride. It wasn't just the sound of my shoes against the pavement, it was something else, something distorted, as though the footsteps were being repeated over and over, like an endless loop. I stopped in my tracks, turning around sharply, expecting to see someone behind me, maybe a person just out of sight. But there was no one. The alley was empty as it had been when I first walked in. The buildings were still the same, the streets still silent. I started walking again, but this time, I paid closer attention to the sound. Each step I took was followed by its own echo, and the echoes seemed to stretch further than they should have, as though they were reaching into the air, hanging there for a moment before fading. But they didn't fade entirely. They lingered, soft whispers, just enough to make me wonder if I was hearing things. The sensation grew as I walked further. The echoes weren't just following me, they were inside me now. Every step seemed to pull me deeper into the silence. I could feel the weight of each echo vibrating through the soles of my feet, through my chest. It was as if the city had quieted down just for me, leaving me alone with my footsteps, with the sound of something I couldn't escape. I tried to tell myself that it was nothing. Just an odd feeling. I had been tired, hadn't I? Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. Maybe the echo was just the sound bouncing off the walls of the narrow street. But the longer I walked, the more I felt the sensation of being followed. Not physically, but in a way that I couldn't shake, as though the echoes were taking on a life of their own. I reached the end of the alley and stepped out onto the main street, expecting the sound to vanish the moment I was back in the city's familiar rhythm. But it didn't. The echo of my steps was still there, just as loud, just as present, as if it had followed me from the quiet of the alley into the bustling street. I turned, half expecting to see something behind me, but the street was still just as busy as it always was, cars passing, people walking by, the hum of city life going on as usual. Yet, there was no mistaking it, the echo was still there, keeping pace with me, an invisible presence that I couldn't shake. That I stopped in the middle of the sidewalk, looking around, my heart beating faster. People passed by, none of them seeming to notice anything unusual. They walked as if everything was normal, their footsteps blending into the chorus of the city, but I could hear it, just beneath the noise of the world, the echo of my own steps following me, relentless, like a shadow that wouldn't leave. That I started walking again, faster now, my pace quickening as I tried to outrun the sound. The city stretched out before me, but the streets felt different now. The hum of life felt distant, muted, like it was all happening somewhere far away. The only sound I could hear clearly was my own footsteps, and the echo that followed, that wouldn't leave me alone. That I don't know how long I walked. That it felt like hours, but when I finally reached my apartment, the city seemed to return to its usual noise, the hum of traffic, the chatter of voices, the sounds of everyday life, all of it rushed back in, as though the world had been holding its breath. But even as I stood in the doorway of my apartment, I could still hear it. The echo of my steps still trailing behind me, still following me, just beneath the surface of the city's noise. And as I closed the door behind me, I realized something unsettling. I wasn't sure if the sound would ever stop. Because the more I listened for it, the more I realized it wasn't just following me. It was inside me. It was my own steps, my own rhythm, but it was something else, too, something darker. And I didn't know how to make it stop.